Friends, welcome. Tonight, we are not just looking at another strike, another map, another set of burning images from a distant front. We are stepping into a moment when two different kinds of pressure hit Russia at the same time from two different directions. And both of them went straight for the same nerve, the fuel that keeps the war alive and the money that keeps the system standing. For nearly 3 years, Russia's leaders have repeated the same promise to their people and to the world, that whatever happens on the battlefield, whatever sanctions are announced, whatever statements come from Washington or Brussels, one thing will hold the country together: oil. Oil as the budget. Oil as leverage. Oil as the proof that Russia can outlast the West, outspend Ukraine, and outweight everyone. Oil has funded this war. It has plugged the holes in the budget, paid salaries to soldiers and propagandists, and allowed the Kremlin to act as if time is on its side. But wars are not won by raw commodities sitting in the ground. They are won by what that commodity can become: fuel, diesel, jet fuel, lubricants, kerosene. Without refineries turning crude into motion, Russia's army is just metal. Its trucks, tanks, aircraft, and missiles do not move. Over the last weeks, Ukraine has pushed that simple truth to the center of the war. On November 11th, Ukrainian long-range drones reached deep inside Russia, hundreds of kilometers from the front, and forced the Saratov oil refinery on the Volga River to halt its primary processing after a series of strikes that caused explosions and a major fire. This was not the first hit on Saratov. It was roughly the 7th major attack on that same facility this year, part of a sustained campaign that has turned one refinery into a symbol of how vulnerable Russia's energy backbone really is. On the same night, drones hit the Orsk refinery in the Orenburg region, around 1,400 kilometers from the front lines. According to Ukrainian and independent reporting, explosions and fire followed as one of the primary oil processing units was struck, the very heart of the plant's ability to turn crude into usable products. And in occupied Crimea, Ukraine has struck fuel storage and port infrastructure, including terminals that help move refined products and crude to the south, tightening the ring around Russia's supply routes to its own invading forces. Taken together, these are not random hits. They are a deliberate attempt to turn Russia's biggest advantage into its biggest liability, to take the one part of the Russian system that looked too big to touch and show that it can, in fact, burn. Analysts have begun to call this the energy war inside the war, a campaign where refineries, depots, and gas processing plants are as important as trenches and artillery positions. But while those fires were still burning, a second shock arrived from a place no missile could reach. Thousands of kilometers away, in boardrooms and trading floors across China, one of Russia's most important oil customers quietly changed course. Yancheng Petroleum, a state-backed Chinese refiner, stopped buying Russian crude in its latest tenders and instead began seeking non-Russian oil for winter deliveries. No speeches, no threats, no dramatic announcement. Just a single choice in a single tender document, but a choice that sent a signal across energy markets. That even in China, even among state-owned companies, the risk of being too close to Russian oil is starting to outweigh the reward. That quiet decision landed in Moscow like an echo of the explosions over Saratov and Orsk. Military pressure from the sky, economic pressure from the markets, both aimed at the same organ, the oil system Russia has relied on as its shield. Tonight, we are going to follow these two currents. We will look at how Ukraine's drones are changing what distance means in war, how U.S. and allied sanctions are forcing even China to recalculate, and how together these forces are exposing something that matters even more than any single refinery: the fragility of a system that thought it could not be touched. To understand why these strikes matter so much, we have to step inside the logic of the energy war itself. For decades, Russia built its oil and gas empire around one assumption: that geography equals safety. Refineries and processing plants were planted deep in the interior of the country, far from any expected front line. In a 20th century war, that logic worked. If the enemy cannot reach your industrial heartland, your fuel keeps flowing. Ukraine is trying to prove that this is no longer true. In 2025, Kyiv dramatically expanded its long-range drone program, deploying cheap but increasingly sophisticated systems capable of flying hundreds, even more than 1,000 kilometers, guided by a mix of GPS, terrain mapping, and real-time intelligence. Their targets were not random warehouses or empty fields. They were specific nodes in Russia's refining network. The Saratov refinery, for example, is not just another plant. It has been described by independent energy monitors as a significant contributor to Russia's domestic fuel supply, and reporting this autumn noted a series of Ukrainian drone attacks that forced it to halt primary refining after explosions and fires. When a refinery like that stops its core processing unit, crude oil can no longer be turned into gasoline, diesel, or jet fuel at that site. The steel and concrete remain, but the function disappears. Orsk tells a similar story. Located roughly 1,400 kilometers from the battlefield, the Orsk refinery was supposed to be beyond reach. Yet Ukrainian drones struck it at least twice in rapid succession, with local and Ukrainian sources reporting damage to a primary processing unit and major fires at the complex. A hit like that does not just cause a spectacular blaze for television. It knocks out the very stage where crude becomes useful. This pattern has repeated across multiple facilities. Reporting from Ukrainian and international outlets has documented strikes on refineries in Saratov, Orsk, Volgograd, and other industrial sites deep inside Russia, forcing temporary shutdowns and highlighting vulnerabilities in a sector that was supposed to be insulated from the war. Each attack adds up to something larger. A growing demonstration that range and precision can substitute for mass. That distance is a calculation, not a guarantee. This is why military and economic analysts talk about an energy front in the war. Ukraine does not need to destroy every refinery permanently. It needs to create uncertainty, raise costs, and force Russia to spend billions on repairs, air defenses, and rerouted logistics, all while reducing the flow of refined products that feed the war. And there is another, quieter effect. Every time a refinery burns and then halts production, Russian fuel exporters lose flexibility. They must choose between sending limited supplies abroad to earn foreign currency or holding more back at home to keep domestic prices from rising and prevent shortages in sensitive regions, including occupied territories like Crimea. In recent months, Russian fuel prices have already been under pressure, and Moscow has been forced to impose temporary export restrictions to stabilize the domestic market. So when you see drone footage of a fireball over a refinery, it is not just a dramatic image. It is the visible tip of a chain reaction that runs through rail yards, truck fleets, air bases, frontline depots, and ultimately kitchen tables inside Russia. It is a contest of endurance that no longer plays out only in trenches, but in distillation columns, storage tanks, and control rooms. Ukraine's message with these strikes is simple and ruthless. If you fund your war with oil, your oil system becomes a fair target. If you believe geography will protect it, we will test that belief. And increasingly, those tests are succeeding. While Ukrainian drones were rewriting the map of what can be hit, another map was being redrawn in a very different arena, the global oil market. For much of the war, Russia's ability to keep exporting crude, especially to Asia, has been the safety valve that kept its budget from imploding. When Europe slashed its purchases and imposed price caps and embargoes, two countries stepped in as the main buyers of Russian oil, India and China. Their refineries bought millions of barrels of discounted Russian crude, shipped through a mixture of conventional tankers and a growing shadow fleet designed to dodge Western restrictions. In return, Moscow gained hard currency and a narrative that sanctions did not work, that the West needs our oil more than we need theirs. I have to really the zintruments. They are all weighted every two. That narrative took a hit this autumn. On October 22nd, the U.S. government escalated its pressure campaign by imposing property-blocking sanctions on Russia's two largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, and many of their subsidiaries. These were not symbolic designations. Together, the two firms account for roughly half of Russia's oil production, and the sanctions came with a clear warning. Banks, traders, insurers, and shippers that continue facilitating their exports could themselves face restrictions. The essence of secondary sanctions. All that. Energy analysts had long predicted that such measures, if truly enforced, would push risk-averse players in Asia to reconsider how much Russian oil they were willing to touch. Within weeks, that prediction started to materialize. In mid-November, multiple reports from Reuters and regional outlets confirmed that Yansheng Petroleum, a Chinese state-backed refiner in Shaanxi province, dropped Russian crude from its latest tender for deliveries from December to mid-February and instead sought non-Russian barrels from producers like the United Arab Emirates and Kazakhstan. This was not a total embargo on Russian oil by China, of course, but it was a notable shift in behavior. Yansheng had been a regular buyer of Russian grades, often taking one cargo per month. Now, with secondary sanctions looming and financial exposure to the U.S. system on the line, the company quietly changed course. It was not alone. Reporting over the same period indicates that other major Chinese refiners, including subsidiaries of Sinopec, have scaled back or temporarily halted direct purchases from Russian exporters targeted by sanctions, preferring to avoid the legal and reputational risk. The logic is cold and simple. Even a generous discount on Russian crude might save tens or hundreds of millions of dollars per year. A misstep that triggers U.S. financial sanctions can cost far more. This is where the energy war and the sanctions war reinforce each other. Every time a refinery in Russia is damaged, Moscow has less refining capacity and must manage its exports more carefully. Every time a refiner in China or India steps back, Russia has fewer reliable buyers. Oil that is harder to refine and harder to sell becomes less of an asset and more of a vulnerability. For Beijing, this is not about friendship or betrayal in the emotional sense. It is about risk management. China still sees Russia as a useful partner in balancing against Western influence, but its companies must also preserve access to dollar financing, global insurance markets, and diversified supplies. In that equation, reducing exposure to sanctioned Russian barrels is a rational choice. From Moscow's perspective, however, the symbolism is painful. For years, Russian officials have described the relationship with China as a no-limits partnership and have publicly insisted that Asian demand can fully replace Western markets. Now, one of those Asian buyers is quietly demonstrating that there are, in fact, limits, and that those limits will be set not in friendly summit declarations, but in procurement desks, legal departments, and risk committees. As Ukrainian drones test the strength of Russia's oil infrastructure, Western sanctions and Chinese caution are testing the strength of its oil diplomacy. The pressure is no longer coming from one direction. It is converging from many. Pressure on infrastructure and pressure from sanctions would be serious enough on their own. But inside Russia, they interact with something more fragile than any pipeline: the political and social contract that has held the system together for 2 decades. Modern Russia's stability rests, to a remarkable degree, on the steady flow of oil and gas revenue. That money has funded pensions and public sector wages, regional subsidies, military modernization, and the sprawling propaganda apparatus that dominates television and much of the online space. It has allowed the Kremlin to present the state as simultaneously feared and protective, a power that can project force abroad while keeping life at home just stable enough. War strains that arrangement. The longer an intense industrial-scale conflict continues, the more resources it consumes. Shells, missiles, spare parts, drones, payments to soldiers and their families, all of it costs money. When refineries are damaged, exports fall, or buyers step back, the pool of money available to cover those costs begins to tighten. Already, Russia has had to make hard choices. Over the past year, Moscow has repeatedly adjusted fuel export rules in an effort to contain domestic price spikes and supply shortages, especially ahead of planting seasons and winter demand. Each adjustment is a reminder that even in an energy giant, fuel is not magically abundant. As strikes on facilities like Saratov and Orsk accumulate, and as sanctions make it harder to route exports through normal channels, those choices sharpen. Does the state prioritize keeping domestic fuel cheap to avoid angering truck drivers, farmers, and ordinary motorists? Or does it prioritize maximizing exports accepting higher prices at home in exchange for more foreign currency to finance the war. None of this guarantees an immediate political crisis. Authoritarian systems can absorb stress for a long time, but it does change the emotional climate. The promise that sanctions do not matter sounds less convincing when footage of burning refineries circulates on social media and when people see fuel prices rising at the pump or hear about export bans on the evening news. There is also a psychological dimension. For years, the Kremlin has cultivated an image of invulnerability, that Western pressure is futile, that Russia's economy is fortress-like, that partners like China will always be there, and that whatever happens on the battlefield, the state remains in control. When Chinese refiners step back, when U.S. sanctions force major companies like Lukoil to consider selling international assets, when the government must admit that key refineries were hit badly enough to halt processing, each of these developments chips away at that image. The official narrative can try to minimize or obscure the damage, but markets and ordinary experiences have a way of telling their own story. Authoritarian power is not built only on fear. It is built on a sense of inevitability, the belief that the system will continue, that there is no alternative. As oil revenues come under pressure from both weapons and sanctions, that inevitability looks less automatic. Regional elites must think harder about their future. Ordinary citizens feel more uncertainty in their daily expenses, and leaders at the top are forced to spend political capital on managing shortages and damage control instead of projecting strength. The drones over Saratov and Orsk are visible signs of this change. The decisions in distant boardrooms in Xi'an, Beijing, Washington, or Brussels are less visible, but no less important. Together, they are forcing Russia to live, for the first time in many years, with a question it has long tried to avoid. What happens when the oil money stops feeling infinite? If you pull back from the individual strikes and sanctions packages, a broader pattern comes into focus. This war is no longer defined only by who advances a few kilometers on a given front. It is increasingly defined by who can apply sustained, intelligent pressure to the systems that keep a modern state at war. On one side, Ukraine is using long-range drones and precision intelligence to force Russia to defend a vast network of refineries, depots, and processing plants, a task that even a large military struggles to do perfectly. Each successful hit raises insurance costs, disrupts flows, and demonstrates to both Russians and the wider world that Russia's energy infrastructure is not beyond reach. On another side, the United States and its allies are tightening sanctions on the biggest pillars of Russia's oil sector, targeting Rosneft, Lukoil, and their subsidiaries with measures designed to make financing, insuring, and shipping Russian crude far more complicated and risky. And from yet another angle, major players in the global market, including Chinese refiners like Yanchang, are adjusting to that risk, quietly diversifying away from Russian barrels and toward other suppliers. They are not acting out of solidarity with Ukraine, but out of self-interest, which in some ways is more powerful, because it does not depend on speeches or summits. It depends on math. The result is not a dramatic collapse on a single day. It is something slower, more structural, a refiner here, a buyer there, a new sanctions clause in a U.S. Treasury document, an insurance premium quietly raised on ships carrying certain grades from certain ports. Each of these is a small piece of pressure. Together, they create an environment in which Russia's room to maneuver shrinks. History often remembers turning points as moments on a map. A city taken, a front broken, a treaty signed. But some turning points are different. They happen when a state built on an assumption that its oil cannot be stopped, that its partners will not walk away, that its infrastructure is safe, is forced to confront the possibility that those assumptions are wrong. That is what November's combination of deep strikes and deep economic shifts represents. Ukrainian drones over Saratov and Orsk show that distance is no longer a defense. New sanctions and Chinese caution show that markets are no longer a blank check. Together, they reveal a vulnerability at the core of Russia's claim to resilience. None of this means the war is close to over, or that outcomes are predetermined. Wars are unpredictable, and Russia still has resources, options, and the ability to inflict immense damage. But the events we have walked through tonight suggest that the balance of pressure is changing direction. For Ukraine and its supporters, that matters. It shows that a strategy built on precision, persistence, and alliance coordination can reach into places that once seemed out of bounds. For Russia's leaders, it raises a question they would rather not ask. How long can a system funded by oil withstand a world that is increasingly willing and increasingly able to make that oil harder to refine, harder to sell, and harder to rely on as a guarantee of power? Friends, thank you for staying with me through this deep dive into the energy front of the war. In the months ahead, we will keep watching the fires, the markets, the sanctions lists, and the subtle shifts in behavior that tell us where this conflict is really heading. Because sometimes the most important battles are not fought over cities, but over the systems that make war possible. When analysts talk about long-term consequences in war, they usually look at territorial control, weapons, stockpiles, or the strength of alliances. But the long-term consequences unfolding here are not about maps. They are about systems, energy, finance, and political legitimacy. And once those systems shift, they rarely shift back. Over the past 2 decades, Russia constructed a model of power built on 3 pillars. The first was energy dominance, the idea that as long as Russia supplied a significant share of the world's oil and gas, it would always have leverage. The second was global market interdependence, the belief that even hostile countries would keep buying because they needed Russian fuel. The third was the perception of internal stability. The idea that regardless of outside pressure, the Kremlin's grip at home would remain firm. Ukraine's deep strikes and China's quiet recalibration have placed all 3 pillars under stress. The hits on the Saratov and Orsk refineries exposed the vulnerability of Russia's infrastructure to long-range precision attacks. Modern warfare no longer respects borders or distance. If Ukraine can disrupt refineries hundreds of miles inside Russia, it sends a message not only to Moscow but to every country watching. The industrial heartland of a state is no longer safe simply because it is far. The Chinese pullback, triggered by U.S. secondary sanctions, sends another message. If Russia's biggest customers behave like global financial actors instead of political allies, Moscow's traditional shield of energy diplomacy has limits. Even without a public confrontation, behavior shifts quietly, and these shifts can reshape entire markets. Most destabilizing of all is the emerging psychological shift. For years, Russia convinced itself that its system could withstand any external shock because oil would always be there to cushion the blow. But when infrastructure burns, when exports become harder to ensure, when prices must be manipulated through emergency bans, when buyers step back, the illusion of infinite oil revenue begins to fracture. Energy may still flow, but it flows through a system that is no longer unquestioned. The long-term consequence is not a sudden collapse. It is a slow erosion. Efficiency drops, costs rise, repairs accumulate, markets diversify. Allies recalculate. Domestic confidence weakens. And each of these adjustments, taken alone, may seem manageable. But together, over time, they transform a country's strategic position. This is why many international observers describe this moment not as a tactical victory for Ukraine, but as a structural shift in the war. Structural shifts endure. They outlast individual battles. They outlast headlines. They outlast the political cycles that produce them. And perhaps most importantly, they redefine what is possible. Ukraine has shown it can reach deep into the Russian system. Sanctions have shown they can reshape global trade behaviors. China has shown it will act when the financial risks become too high. Europe has shown it can live without Russian energy. The United States has shown it can move markets with a single regulatory decision. All these lessons will shape the next stage of the conflict more than any territory gained or lost in a single month. As we reach the end of this story, step back for a moment and picture the 2 images that define this turning point. A refinery burning in the darkness of a Russian industrial heartland, its flames reaching far above the rooftops. and a quiet spreadsheet in a Chinese boardroom where a refinery manager moved a cursor, changed a procurement line, and erased millions of barrels of Russian crude from future orders. One image is loud. One is silent. One shakes the ground. One barely moves the air. Yet both send the same signal. The center of gravity in this war is moving. Those fires inside Russia were more than explosions. They were a reminder that even the deepest parts of the Russian system are reachable. That distance is no longer protection. That the infrastructure Moscow believed untouchable can be threatened by persistence, intelligence, and the evolution of low-cost, long-range strike capabilities. And that quiet line change in China was more than a business adjustment. It was a signal that Russia's future may not be shaped by loyalty or partnership, but by math, risk, and global financial exposure. That the partners Moscow relies on will not jeopardize their access to the world's largest markets for the sake of political symbolism. Put together, these two moments reveal something deeper than any single attack or sanction. They reveal a shift in how the world interacts with Russia. A shift from tolerance to caution, from reliance to diversification, from assumption to doubt. Wars rarely turn on one battle. They turn when the system behind a war begins to strain under pressures it can no longer hide. That is what we witnessed here. A night when Ukraine reached deeper than ever before. A night when China quietly stepped back. A night when global markets began recalculating what Russian oil is worth. A night when Russia's aura of inevitability flickered. Not collapsed, not shattered, but flickered in a way the world could see. And that flicker matters. It is in moments like this, small cracks, silent choices, distant explosions, that the trajectory of a conflict begins to bend. Not dramatically at first, but gradually, persistently, until the path forward is no longer the one that seemed certain months before. If this war is ultimately decided by pressure, coordination, and the ability to adapt faster than the opponent, then November 11th was more than a date. It was the beginning of a new phase. A phase where Ukraine is reaching farther, where sanctions are biting deeper, where markets are shifting quicker, and where Russia's most powerful weapon, oil, is starting to feel less like a shield and more like a vulnerability. In the weeks and months ahead, we will continue to see the aftershocks of this moment. They will appear in energy markets, in political signals, in economic data, in quiet decisions that never make headlines but change the world all the same. Because wars are shaped not only by what armies do, but by how nations respond when pressure reveals the truth. And the truth revealed on that night was simple. Russia can be pressured, systems can be shaken, assumptions can fail. And when pressure comes from the sky and from the markets at the same time, even the strongest states must rethink the stories they tell about themselves. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. The world is shifting faster than many expected, and we will be here to follow each step, each sign, and each change that points toward the future of this conflict.